Mr. Speaker, today the Winnipeg Free Press published an editorial that called for the departure of the NDP's Minister of Finance, saying, and I quote, "Manitoba's NDP government broke the law and abused its power in what appears to have been a spiteful attempt to force Assiniboia Downs to cease operations and sell its land and racetrack to another party favoured by the province. I ask the Premier, for this and many other reasons, will he remove the member from Dauphin from his position as Minister of Finance and replace him with a consistently law-abiding minister?"
Mr. Speaker, I would invite the member from River Heights, the Leader of the Liberal Party, also to read the judgment. He will find in the judgment that the judge recommends that any changes to what he defines as a public subsidy should be done by way of a legislative amendment. Our budget clearly set out that is exactly the course of action that we intend to follow. We will follow the recommendations of the judge because we already understood that was the necessary way to proceed, and we indicated that in the budget. We completely agree with the judge. That's why we put it that way in the budget, even before the judgment came out, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, the NDP's Minister of Finance was $130 million over its expenditure budget last year. He announced that he will disregard the legally required referendum to raise the PST by changing the legislation. The 1% PST increase will raise almost $200 million this year, and yet the Premier and Finance Minister state they would use the extra PST revenue for flood infrastructure, yet won't name the projects nor provide timelines or budgets for them. Furthermore, the Finance Minister made numerous commitments with respect to the flood of 2011 which were never delivered. I ask the Premier, for these numerous ethical and legal lapses, will you fire the Finance Minister?
This member, who is currently the Minister of Finance, also the former Minister of Agriculture, brought in the most generous program of support for flood victims around Lake Manitoba in the history of the province of Manitoba. The most generous program. For the 250 producers around Lake Manitoba, the amount that was spent was in the order of $120 million, Mr. Speaker. The total amount made available was in the order of $1.25 billion, Mr. Speaker. And many of the programs to support producers were 100% paid for by the province of Manitoba. The federal government refused to participate in those programs, Mr. Speaker. The members opposite know that. The feds refused to participate. Manitoba stepped up and made a difference for all the people affected by the 2011 flood, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, 2 years ago, I was in Lake St. Martin on May the 8th as people were evacuated due to the flood of 2011. Today, almost 2,000 residents remain without a home community to return to after being artificially flooded by this government. Right? The Minister of Finance could have made it a top priority to honour the wishes of this community to rebuild on suitable land. Instead, 2 years later, we have a minister who has finally acknowledged that those houses are not livable, as anybody who's been there would have observed very shortly after the flood. 2 years later, the community of Lake St. Martin remains in limbo, with children having to live like refugees a long distance from their home in temporary circumstances. I ask the Premier, will he remove the Minister of Finance and replace him with a minister who will put the re-establishment and rebuilding of Lake St. Martin as a top priority?
This government has made getting people home a top priority. That is something that I can tell the member opposite that every single day, senior officials supported by this cabinet work on resolving the issue of getting people home. Young children in the city have been supported with a special program, Brighter Futures program, to ensure that they continue to get a good education. People have been provided temporary support. We immediately bought additional land for the people of Lake St. Martin, land that was on higher ground, to ensure that if they wanted to rebuild in that community, that they would no longer be impacted by floods. We proceeded very quickly to build an emergency channel, a $100 million effort, Mr. Speaker, to bring that lake down an additional 3 feet. And that has served us very well, not only in 11 and 12, but also in the spring of 2013. We know that these people deserve to be home. We will get them home. We are working very closely now with the federal government to advance that agenda, and I believe that progress will continue to be made as we move forward. And I only hope the leader
Order,
of the
please. First Minister's time has expired.